Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, we're relaxing with a brand new book recommended by one of your fellow listeners. And wow, is it right up my alley. We're reading Life on a Medieval Barony, a picture of a typical feudal community in the 13th century, by William Stearns Davis, Ph.D., Professor of History in the University of Minnesota. First published in 1922 by Harper & Brothers Publishers, New York and London. Let's begin. To Ephraim Emerton, master interpreter of medieval history, this book is dedicated by an ever-grateful pupil. Preface. This book describes the life of the feudal ages in terms of the concrete. The discussions center around a certain seigneury of St. Aliquis. If no such barony is easily identifiable, at least there were several hundred second-grade fiefs scattered over Western Christendom, which were in essential particulars extremely like it. And its Baron Conan and his associates were typical of many similar individuals, a little worse or a little better, who abounded in the days of Philip Augustus. No custom is described which does not seem fairly characteristic of the general period. To focus the picture, a specific region, northern France, and a specific year, AD 1220, have been selected. Not many matters have been mentioned, however, which were not more or less common to contemporaneous England and Germany. Nor have many usages been explained, which would not frequently have been found as early as AD 1100 or as late as 1300. Northern France was par excellence the homeland of feudalism, and hardly less so of chivalry, while by general consent the years around 1220 mark one of the great turning epochs of the Middle Ages. We are at the time of the development of French kingship under Philip Augustus, of the climax and the beginning of the waning of the crusading spirit, of the highest development of Gothic architecture, of the full blossoming of the popular Romance literature, and of the beginning of the entirely dissimilar but even more important friar movement. To make the life of the Middle Ages live again in its pageantry and its squalor, its superstition and its triumph of Christian art and love is the object of this study. Many times has the author been reminded of the intense contrast between sublime good and extreme evil everywhere apparent in the feudal epoch. With every effort at impartiality, whether praising or condemning, it is dangerously easy to write in superlatives. Although the preparation of this book was not undertaken without that knowledge and investigation of those medieval authors, ecclesiastics, and laymen upon which every significant study of this kind must rest, every scholar will recognize the author's debt to many modern specialists. To Thomas Wright, Lacroix, Luchaire, Justin H. Smith, Viollet-le-Duc, and Cheroul, the acknowledgments are very specific. To Leon Gautier, they must be more specific still. It is a great misfortune that his masterpiece, La Chevalerie, is no longer current in a good English translation. The words in quotation, sprinkled through the text, are usually from pertinent medieval writers, except where they purport to be direct snatches of conversation. To my colleague in this university, Professor Auguste C. Cray, who has read and criticized the manuscript with friendly fidelity and professional alertness and acumen, there are due many hearty thanks. William Stearns Davis, The University of Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Life on a Medieval Barony, Chapter 1, The Fief of St. Aliquis, Its History and Denizens. In the Duchy of Quelquepart, there lay in the later days of the great king Philip Augustus the barony of St. Aliquis. Perhaps you may have trouble in finding any such places upon the maps of medieval France. In that case, I must tell you that they did not lie so far from Burgundy, Champagne, and Blois that the Duke and his vassal, the Baron, could not have many brave feuds with the seigneurs of those principalities, nor so far from Paris that peddlers and pilgrims could not come hence or go thither pretty often, nor the Baron of St. Aliquis sometimes journey to the king's court to do his loyal devoir to his high suzerain, or to divert himself with many lordly pleasures. About A.D. 1220, when King Philip Augustus was near his end, there was exceptional peace in northern France, and conditions around St. Aliquis were entirely normal. We purposed, therefore, with the help of Our Lady, of holy St. Aliquis himself, and perhaps also of that very discreet fay, Queen Morgou, the wife of Julius Caesar and the mother of King Oberon, to visit the aforesaid barony as it existed at that time. We shall look around us unseen by the inhabitants, but able to ask many questions and to get pertinent answers. Thereby shall we gather much knowledge, and that too not about St. Aliquis only, for this little world by itself is a cross-section, as it were, of a great part of France, nay, of all feudal Europe. It is fortunate that we are suffered, when we make this return journey to the Middle Ages, to arrive not long after the year 1200. A century or two earlier, one might have found conditions decidedly more crude, semi-barbarous, disgusting. One would have indeed been tempted to doubt whether from so lawless and uncultivated a world any progressive civilization could really develop. On the other hand, had we postponed the excursion until, say, A.D. 1400, we would have found a society already becoming sophisticated and to no slight extent modernized. The true medieval flavor would have been partially lost. But A.D. 1220 represents the epoch when the spirit of the Middle Ages had reached its full development. The world was still full of ignorance, squalor, and violence, yet there were now plenty of signs of a nobler day. France was still scattered with feudal castles, and tales of baronial ruthlessness abounded, but the rise of the royal power and the growth of the chartered communal towns were promising a new political era. The bulk of the people were still illiterate peasants, and many of the nobility even felt very awkward when fumbling over books. But the monasteries had never been so full of worthy activities and of very genuine learning. Thousands of scholars were trudging to the University of Paris, and meantime, even in the more starving towns were rising Gothic churches and cathedrals, combining in their soaring fabrics not merely the results of supreme architectural genius, but a wealth of masterpieces of sculpture and of colored glass, which were to draw visitors of later days from the very ends of the earth. The crusading fervor had somewhat waned, but around the castles there were still elderly knights who had once followed Richard the Lion-Hearted or Philip Augustus upon the great Third Crusade to Palestine. Likewise a good many younger cavaliers who had shared the military glory and moral disgrace of the Fourth Crusade, which had ended not with the recovery of Jerusalem, but the sack and seizure of Christian Constantinople. At Rome, the great and magnanimous Pope Innocent III had hardly ceased to reign in 1216, while the founders of the remarkable Friar movement, that new style of monasticism which was to carry the message of the Church closer to the people, St. Francis, the Apostle of Love, and St. Dominic, the Apostle of Learning, were still alive and active. The world, therefore, was looking forward. The Middle Ages were close to apogee. We purpose to tell what may be found on the Barony of St. Eliquis, first at the castle itself, and in the household of Messire the Seigneur, then in the villages of peasants round about, next in the abbey slightly removed, and lastly in the chartered town and cathedral seat of the bishop a few miles further off. But first, one must ask about the origin of the principality and how there came to be any such barony at all. For St. Eliquis would have been an exceptional seigneury if it had not had considerable history behind it, and had not represented the growth of several different elements. The castle of St. Eliquis lies at the junction of two rivers. The smaller of these, the Rapide, tumbles down from some hills, cutting a gorge through the dense beech forest until it runs under a precipitous slope, then dashes into the greater, more placid current of the Clare. The Clare is an affluent, perhaps of the Seine, perhaps of the Loire. It is navigable for flat barges a good many miles above its junction with the Rapide, and the tolls upon this commerce swell the baron's revenue. At the triangle formed by the converging streams rises an abrupt rocky plateau practically inaccessible from the banks of either river, and which can be approached only from the third side, where the land slopes gently away from the apex of the triangle. Here rise some jagged crags, marking out the place as a natural fortress. Most castles which dot feudal Europe are thus located in the most advantageous spot in their respective regions. Possibly human habitations have existed upon this promontory ever since God drove Adam and Eve out of Eden. If we consult Brother Boniface, the librarian at the local monastery, the best read person in the district, The good old man will tell us that long before the Romans came, the ancient Druids, now in hell, had their pagan altars here and sacrificed human victims under a great oak. Some chiseled masonry found on the spot also indicates an extensive settlement in Roman days, when Gaul was a province of the Caesars. Of course, all the pious people know that under the persecuting Emperor Diocletian, the holy Aliquis himself, a centurion in the legions, was shot to death with burning arrows because he preferred Christ to Jupiter, and that the place of his martyrdom is at the new abbey church, about a league from the castle. Nevertheless, secular history is not precise until after the time of the mighty Charlemagne. Under his feeble successor, Charles the Bald, tradition affirms that the Vikings, Scandinavian barbarians, came up the greater river, ascended the Clare in their long dragon ships. Then, on the site of the present castle, they established a stockaded camp, whence they issued to ravage the country. This was about AD 870, but after a year they departed, leaving desolation behind them. About AD 880, another band of Vikings came with similar foul intent, but they met a different reception. The saints had raised up a brave protector for the Christian folk of those lands. Very uncertain is the ancestry of the redoubtable warrior Heribert, who about AD 875 seized the rocky triangle at the mouth of the Rapide and built the first castle of St. Aliquis. Perhaps he was descended from one of Charlemagne's famous Frankish counts. He did, indeed, only what was then being done everywhere to check the Scandinavian hordes. He built a castle and organized the levies of the region, hitherto footmen, into an effective cavalry force. This castle was anything save the later majestic fortress. It was merely a great square tower of rough masonry, perched on the crag above the streams. Around it was a palisade of heavy timbers, strengthened on the landward side by a ditch. Inside this compound were huts for refugees, storehouses for fodder, and rude stalls for the cattle. To stop passage up the Clare, a heavy chain of iron was stretched across the river, and stone piers were sunk at shallow places, thus forcing boats to pass close under the fortress in range of descending missiles. Where the chain was landed, there was built another smaller stone tower. All the crossing then had to be by skiffs, although somewhat later an unsteady bridge was thrown over the stream. The second expedition of Vikings found that these precautions had ruined their adventure. They lost many men and a dragon ship when they tried to force the iron chain. Heribert's new cavalry cut off their raiding parties. Finally they departed, with thinned numbers and scant spoils. Heribert was hailed as savior of the region, just as other champions, notably the great Count Odo at the siege of Paris, won similar successes elsewhere on a larger scale. The Vikings had departed, but Heribert's tower remained. So began the castle of St. Aliquis. Heribert had taken possession ostensibly as the king's man, claiming some royal commission, but as the power of Charlemagne's feeble rulers dwindled, Heribert's heirs presently forgot almost all their allegiance to their distant royal master. This was merely as seemed the case about AD 900, all through the region then coming to be called France. Castles were rising everywhere, sometimes to repel the Vikings, sometimes merely to strengthen the power of some local chief. Once erected, the lords of those castles were really little princes, able to defy the very weak central authority. To capture a considerably less formidable fortalice than St. Eliquis implied a tedious siege, such as few kings would undertake save in an emergency. The result was that ere AD 1000, Heribert's great-grandsons had almost ceased to trouble about a king. The person they genuinely feared was the local Duke of Quelquepart, another feudal seigneur with more followers and more castles than they. Partly from prudence, partly from necessity, they had done homage to him, become his men, and as his vassals rode to his wars. The dukes, in turn, full of their own problems, and realizing the strength of St. Eliquis, seldom interfered in the fief, save on very serious occasions. The barons of St. Eliquis therefore acted very nearly like sovereign princes. They, of course, had their own gallows with power of life and death, waged their own personal wars, made treaties of peace, and even coined a little ill-shapen money with their own superscription. Barons by the grace of God, they boasted themselves, which meant that they obeyed the Duke and his suzerain, the King, very little, and we fear God not a great deal. In the recent centuries, however, the barony had changed hands several times. About 1070, the lord had the folly to refuse his ordinary feudal duty to the Duke of Quelquepart. The latter roused himself, enlisted outside aid, and blockaded and starved out the castle of St. Eliquis. The unfortunate baron, duly adjudged traitor and felon by his peers, his fellow vassals, was beheaded. The Duke then bestowed the fief with the hand of the late owner's niece upon Sire Ranulph, a younger son of a South Country viscount who had visited the Duke's court, bringing with him an effective battle-axe and 50 sturdy followers. Sire Ranulph, however, died while in the First Crusade. The reigning duke next tried to give the barony to another favorite warrior, but the son of the late baron proved himself of sturdy stuff. He fought off his suzerain and enlisted allies from Burgundy. The duke was forced, therefore, to leave him in peace. Presently, about 1140, another baron died, survived only by a daughter. Her uncles and cousins did their best to expel this poor lady, and induce the suzerain duke to close his eyes to their deeds. But fortunately, the new baroness had been very pious. The influence of the great Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was exerted, thereby persuading King Louis VII to warn the duke that if he could not protect his vassals, the king would do justice. So the Lady Bertrada was given in marriage to a respectable Flemish cavalier, Guy, who ruled the barony with only the usual wars. He left 2 sons, Garnier and Henri. Sire Henri, the younger, lived at the inferior castle of Petitmeur, went on the Fourth Crusade, 1203–04, and perished in the fighting around Constantinople ere the French and Venetians sacked the city. Garnier the Elder received, of course, the great castle. He was the uncle of the Baron Conon III, the son of Henri, and the present lord of St. Aliquis. It is well said by the monks that the blessed feel joys in paradise all the keener because a little earlier they have escaped from the pangs and fires of purgatory. Certes, for all laymen and clerics on the St. Aliquis fiefs, there was purgatory enough in Baron Garnier's day to make the present sage rule of Baron Conon seem tenfold happy. The late seigneur ruled about 20 years, filled up with one round of local wars, oppression of the small, and contentions with the great. Baron Garnier was assuredly a mighty warrior. Never was he unhorsed in jousting or in melee. His face was one mass of scars, and he had lost an ear. Plenty of landless knights and wolfish men at arms rioted around his donjon. His provosts and foresters knew how to squeeze the poor of the seigneury, and by this income, and by the ransoms from numerous captives, he was able to rebuild the castle of St. Aliquis according to the first military art of the day. But his sins were more than the hairs of his grizzled head. Having taken dislike to his wife, and the bishop refusing an annulment, he kept the poor Lady Ada mewed up in one chamber for years, and according to many stories, loaded her with chains until in mercy she died. However, he had plenty of less regular consorts. The castle courts had swarmed with loud women, the favorites of himself and his familiars, and with their coarse, unacknowledged brats. No pretty peasant girl's honor was safe in those parts. As for the prisoners, after Messire Conon came into power, it was a marvel the quantity of human bones, gnawed by the rats, which they took out of the lower dungeons, as well as how they released 4 wretches who had been incarcerated in the dark so long that they were blinded. Needless to say, the compartments of the gallows never lacked their swinging skeletons. Women still hushed their squalling children with, "Be silent, or Baron Garnier will get you." Yet with all these deeds, the Baron affected great hospitality. He kept a roaring hall, with ready welcome for any cavalier who enjoyed deep drinking and talking of horses, women, falcons, and forays, and a good many seigneurs found his alliance useful. So he continued his evil ways until, praised be Our Lady of Mercies, he came to a fit end. Thrice he had been excommunicated by the bishop. Thrice he had been readmitted to ghostly favor, thanks to large gifts toward the new cathedral at Pont-de-Bois. Then he let his men murder a priest who was traveling with a precious chalice, so he was excommunicated a 4th time. While in this perilous state, though boasting that he would soon make his new terms with the church, his companion in sin, Suger of the Iron Arm, quarreled with him over their cups and ran him through with a boar spear. The Baron lived just long enough to see Suger hewn in pieces by his comrades. Then he died, priestless of course and unabsolved. cursing God and crying piteously for help from the devil. Christians cross themselves when they think of his fate hereafter. Garnier left no legitimate children. He was on very cold terms with his brother's widow, the Lady Odalina, who was rearing her 2 sons and daughter at Pettimure. But Odalina had faced her brother-in-law down and clung tightly to her own little fief. She had given her children a courteous and pious education, and induced a neighboring seigneur to take her eldest son, Conon, to nourish as his squire and rear to be a knight. At length came her reward. The youth was knighted by the Count of Champagne 3 weeks before his evil uncle perished. Then the suzerain duke was glad to have St. Eliquis pass to so competent a vassal as young Sire Conon. This is a bare suggestion of the contentions, feuds, and downright wars of which the barony has been the scene. And yet, St. Eliquis has probably been freer from such troubles than most of its neighbors. Although this castle is the center of Baron Conon's power, it is by no means his only strong place. He has 3 other smaller castles, besides Pettimure, which will go to his brother, that he sometimes inhabits, but which he ordinarily rules through castellans. In the 20-odd villages upon the fief, there are some 10,000 peasants, whom he governs through his provosts. Also, there depend on him his own noble vassals, about 12 sires, petty nobles each with his own small castle or tower, hamlet of peasants, and right to low justice. These vassals follow the St. Eliquis banner, and otherwise contribute to the baron's glory. That seigneur himself is likewise advocate, a secular guardian of the neighboring abbey of St. Eliquis, an honorable post involving delicate dealings with the Lord Abbot. Also, a few leagues away lies the good town of Pont-de-Bois. The baron, as will be explained, has very important relations with that city. In addition, he holds of the bishop there resident some farms with hunting and fishing rights. For this inferior fief he does homage, of course, not to the Duke of Quelquepart, but to the Bishop of Pont-de-Bois. Some years previous, when the Duke and Bishop were at war, the Baron was obligated to send 20 knights to fight for the Duke, but also 6 to fight for the Bishop. The scriptures warn us against trying to serve 2 masters, but the Baron happily made shift to keep the 2 contingents of his little array from engaging with one another until his 2 overlords had made peace. In addition to all the above, Conon holds still another small castle at quite a distance, for which he does homage to the Duke of Burgundy, a fact promising more complications when Quelquepart and Burgundy, as is most likely, go to war. Finally, he holds a large farm from his otherwise equal, the Baron of Harcourt. Here he is sure to cut his feudal devoir to a minimum, and leave the Lord of Harcourt to consider whether to pocket his pride, risk a private war, or attempt a lawsuit before their mutual suzerain, the Duke of Quelquepart. The Baron Conon would gladly be the direct vassal of the king. The higher your suzerain, the higher, on the whole, your own glory in the feudal firmament, but the Duke would resent bitterly any attempt to get his vassals away, and all the other first-class nobles would support him. Baron Cannon must wait, therefore, perhaps until the present elderly Duke is dead, and the duchy falls under feeble heirs. Then he will find the astute king, if Philip Augustus is still reigning, only too willing and able to meet him halfway. At present, however, Cannon is on good terms with the Duke, although he is just as jealous himself to prevent his own sires from holding directly from the Duke as the latter is to check the barons going over to the king. Everywhere there is this friction over subinfeudation. The vassal of my vassal is not my vassal. That is the angry comment daily. All in all, the seigneury of St. Aliquis thus covers 300 square miles, whereof about 1/3 is controlled by the baron as his personal domain, and the remainder by his vassals. Perhaps there are 200 similar baronies and countships dotting France, some larger, some smaller, but in their histories, feudal relationships, and general problems much alike. This fief, however, is especially fortunate in that the baron possesses an old charter, wrung from some tottering Carolingian king, giving him the right to collect a sack of grain, a large truss of hay, or a similar quota in kind from every loaded barge traversing down the navigable Clare, also to levy a copper obol for every Christian foot passenger, and 3 obols for every mounted traveler crossing the very important bridge by the castle. These tolls give Messire many fine suits of armor, buy silk gowns for the baroness, and make all the local seigneurs anxious to marry their daughters to the baron's sons as soon as the boys can be knighted. St. Aliquis, we have said, is happy in its present seigneur. Monks, villeins, and petty nobles agree in praising Baron Cannon. When a seigneur is practically a sovereign, everything depends upon his character. If the saints desire to punish certain Christians for their sins, let them merely send them an evil, or only an inefficient, quarrelsome baron. Like the unlamented Garnier, he can soon make their lives into a perfect Gehenna. Conon III has now ruled for more than 10 years. He has kept out of all private wars but one, a feat almost exceptional. But in that one war, he struck so hard and so skillfully that his opponent, the Viscount of Fort Vert, swore on the relics to a peace which cost him a village of peasants and the transfer of 2 petty sires to the St. Aliquis fealty. Cannon fought also in the great battle of Beauvais, so as to win the personal praise of the king himself. He compounded with the abbey over the division of the income of a farm in a manner which left him and the abbot firm friends, a singular piece of diplomacy. Better still, he held to his point about some hunting rights with the Bishop of Pont de Bois, and finally won most of his claims without being even temporarily subjected to excommunication. His peasants paid their imposts loyally, for the baron not merely protects them from the raids of brigands and rival feudatories, he also represses worse pillagers still, his own seigneurial officers, who were ravaging harpies in all the little thatched villages through Baron Garnier's day. Therefore, Conan is called a very gentle seigneur, which means that he is every inch a lord, and which term does not prevent him from swinging a heavy sword, and from knocking down a villain with his own fist when there is need of teaching a lesson. As for Conan's family, his good mother, Lady Odalina, is now resting under the stones of the abbey church. But she lived to see her firstborn wedded to Adela, the daughter of a rich Picard sire, a dame of many virtues. The marriage has been blessed with 2 healthy sons, Francois and Anceau, the pampered tyrants of all the castle folk. The Baron's household also includes his younger brother, Amri, who has just reached the age for knighthood, and his marriageable sister, Eleanor. So far, the family has been marvelously harmonious. There has been none of those passages at arms between elder and younger brothers, which often make a castle the antechamber to hell. Adela is the very gentle dame, beloved of husband and revered by vassals and villeins, but whose gentleness, like her husband's, by no means keeps her from flogging her maids when their sins deserve it. Eleanor is already going to tourneys, and has presented at least 3 young knights with her stockings to tie to their lances. But she knows that it is a brother's duty to find a husband for one sister, and Conan has promised that whoever he selects will be young, brave, and kindly. Therefore, Eleanor is not borrowing trouble. As for Amri, he is proud of being almost as good a hawker and jouster as his brother. He will soon be knighted and rule over Petamure, but his head is full of a visit to the king's court, of winning vast favor, and finally, of being given the only daughter and heiress of a great count. In short, of possessing a fief bigger than St. Aliquis. There, then, is the little world, ruled by persons perhaps a little more honorable and kindly than the run of North French barons, but by no means of impossible virtue. It is June, A.D. 1220. The sun is just rising. Let us enter St. Aliquis as the warders unbar the gates, for the castle is the heart of the feudal civilization. And as much as I would like to take us through those gates, the next chapter is really long, so I think we'll end this evening's reading from Life on a Medieval Barony. I think this might be one of my favorite recommendations, and I hope you enjoyed that as well. I can't wait to read more of it. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.